In this lecture, let's learn how we can show a custom validation error message whenever there is some invalid data in a form control. So in the last lecture, we learned that for each form control, Angular adds some CSS classes on that form control based on whether that form is touched or it is dirty or it is valid or not. For example, for this first name input element, as you can see, some CSS classes has been added like ng untouched, ng pristine and ng invalid. That's because this form control, this first name form control, it has not been touched. So this ng untouched CSS class has been added. Its value has not changed. So this ng pristine CSS class has been added, and it has some invalid value because this first name is a required field. So it should have some value. It cannot be empty string. And that's why ng invalid CSS class has been added on this first name input element. Now, if I focus inside this first name input element, and now if I click somewhere outside, in that case, this form control is touched. So you see, ng untouched CSS class has been removed and ng touched CSS class has been added. In the same way, if I enter some data inside this first name form control, you will notice that ng pristine and ng invalid has been removed and ng dirty and ng valid CSS class has been added on this first name input element. And we can make use of these CSS classes to our advantage. For example, what I want is when there is some invalid data inside this first name input element, I want to show its border in red. For that, let's go to VS Code and let's go to app-component.css, and there let's first create a CSS class. And the CSS class name must be ng invalid because this ng invalid CSS class gets added to the form control when it is not valid. So in this first name form control, currently you will see that ng invalid CSS class has been added because this form control does not have a valid value. It is a required field, so it should have some valid value. But currently it contains empty string. That's why on this form control, this ng invalid has been added. So we are making use of this ng invalid CSS class. Okay, so here we have created this ng invalid CSS class, and when on a form control we have this ng invalid CSS class added, at that time we want to show the border in red. So here I am going to set the border property, and there I will say the border should be red, it should be 2 pixel and it should be solid. Now if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, you will notice that since the form is invalid, because this first name, last name and email is a required field and we have not entered any value for this first name, last name and email. So the form is invalid. And since the form is invalid, the form has this red border. But we do not want to show the red border on the form. Instead, we want to show the red border on the form controls, on these input elements. So here I'll change the CSS class a little bit. So before this ng invalid, we'll also include input. So if the form control is of input type, and on that form control, if this ng invalid CSS class is added, then we want to show its border in red. With this, if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, you will not see the border of these form controls in red. That's because if I go back and if I scroll up, here you will notice that on that input element, we are adding a border. So what I will do is I will comment this line. Okay, so after this border is getting added using this ng invalid, after that this CSS class was being overridden by this line. That's why the border color was not changing. But now if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, now you should see that the border color is in red. But for other controls, the border color is now black because we have removed that CSS class which was setting the border for these controls to gray. Anyway, I will leave it like this. So as you can see, the border colors are now changed to red whenever the form control has invalid value. But if I enter something in these form controls, now you will notice that that red border has been removed. Now, what I want is initially when the form loads, this web page loads, that time I don't want to show the red border. I only want to show the red border on invalid form controls when that form control is focused and without entering any valid value in that form control, user clicks somewhere else. That time only I want to show this red border. For that, we can also use the ng-touched CSS class. So what we want is, if the form control is touched and if it has invalid value, then only we want to show this red border. So let's again go back and let's change the CSS class a little bit. So what we want is, when the form control is of type input, and on that form control we have this ng invalid CSS class, and also on that we have this ng touched CSS class. That means when the form control is touched. So it should be ng touched. Then only we want to show this red border. With this, if we save the changes, if we go back to the web page, initially you will see we don't have the red border, but if I click inside this first name text box, and if I don't enter any valid value and if I click outside, now you will see that its border has changed to red. In the same way, this last name, it is also a required field. So currently it does not have a valid value, but since this last name control is not touched yet, we don't see this red border. But if I touch this form control and if I don't enter a valid value and if I click outside, its border color has also changed to red. But if I go ahead and if I enter some valid value, in that case, what will happen is the ng invalid CSS class will be removed. And when the ng CSS class will be removed, its border will not get set to red. Because in order to set this border red, the form control should have this ng invalid CSS class as well as this ng touched CSS class. Okay. The next thing what I want is, if the form control does not have a valid value, in that case, I also want to show a custom validation error message. For that, let's go to VS Code. Let's go to appcomponent.html, and here we have our form. After this input element, let me go ahead and let me add another div. In this div, I'm going to use this small tag, and here I will say first name is a required field. Okay, let me also show an asterisk before this. All right, now on this small element, I want to add some CSS class. So let's go to appcomponent.css, and all I want to do is I want to show the text color in red, and font weight, it should be bold. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. So here you can see it says first name is a required field. Now let me actually go ahead and let me move this div inside this div where we are defining this input element. So maybe here. Let's save the changes now. Let's go back to the web page, and now it is showing just below this first name form control. Okay, so it says first name is a required field. Now I don't want to show this error message always. I only want to show this error message when the user has touched this form control and he has not entered a valid value there. Let's see how we can achieve that. So let's go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is, on this first name input element, so first of all let me move these attributes in a separate line so that it will be more readable. And on that, I'm going to add a template reference variable. For that, we use a pound sign and we specify a name. And I'm going to call this template reference variable fname. So in this way, this fname will store a reference to this input element in the DOM. But there it is going to return us this input element HTML. But here, I want this input element as a JavaScript object. For that, to this fname, what we can do is we can assign ng model. Okay, so we learned that when we use this ng model, it tells Angular that this input element is a form control for this form. So this ng model, in this case, it is going to store a reference to this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So basically, in this case, if I click on this submit button, so this submit button is not working because currently it is disabled. So let me enter some valid value in these forms. And now when I click on this submit button, here in this controls property, we have this first name form control. So this first name form control, it will be assigned to this fname reference variable when we are assigning this ng model to it. So for this form control, this ng model, it is going to store a reference to this first name form control, and we are assigning that to this fname template reference variable. So this fname template reference variable, it is storing a reference to this fname form control. And on this fname form control, we have this valid property, and we also have a touched property. Okay, so we are going to make use of these properties of this form control. So let's go to VS Code. So what we want is, we only want to display this message if this form control is touched and if it does not has a valid value. So let's go back to VS Code, and on this small element, I'm going to use ng if directive, and here we will check. So I'm going to make use of this template reference variable. So here we want to check if that form control is invalid. So we will say fname dot invalid. Again, this fname, it is going to store a reference to this input element in the form of JavaScript object. So there we want to check if the fname is invalid, and if it is touched, then only we want to display this error message. So again, I'll say fname dot touched. Okay, so if the first name input element is invalid and it is touched, then only we want to display this error message. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. So now you will see initially that error message is not being displayed. But if I click inside this first name form control, and if I don't enter any valid value, and if I click outside, now you will see that the border of that form control is red, and it is also showing this error message, first name is a required field. Let's do the same thing for last name as well as email field. So I'll copy this div and I'll paste it for the last name, and I'll also paste it for this email field. Okay, and now let's modify this error message. So here let's say last name is a required field, and on this last name also let's add a template reference variable. Let's call it lname, and now instead of using this fname reference variable, we are going to use lname. In the same way, here also let's modify this error message. Here let's say entered email is not valid. Okay, and on this email input element also, let's add a template reference variable. Let's call it email, and let's use this email template reference variable here and here. Now currently, this email template reference variable, it is going to store a reference to this input element, and it will return us the HTML of that input element. But here we don't want the HTML, we want the JavaScript object for that input element. So to this email we also need to assign ng model. Same thing we need to do for lname, because we want this last name form control in the form of a JavaScript object. So here also let's assign ng model. Okay, let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page and let's see if it works. So if I click inside this last name and if I click outside, you will see that message, last name is a required field. But if I enter a valid value inside this last name, then that error message is gone. In the same way, if I click inside this email field, but if I don't enter any value and if I click outside, we see this message, entered email is not valid, and the border is also red for that form control. But if I enter a valid value, in that case, that error is gone. Now, if you want, you can also add the validation for other controls as well. But here I'm not going to do that, because if I start adding validation for each of these form controls, this video will become quite lengthy. So please do this as your own and consider it as an assignment. All right. Finally, what we can also do is we can also do two-way data binding on these form controls. Let's see how we can do that. And doing that is very easy, and we already know it from our previous lectures. So on this first name, last name, and email, I also want to do two-way data binding. For that, I'm going to create three properties here. I'm going to create this first name property. It is going to be of type string, and initially let me assign it with empty string. In the same way, let's create last name property. It is also going to be of type string, and initially it will be empty string. Let's also create a property called email. Again, it is going to be of type string, and initially it will be empty string. Now we are going to do two-way data binding using these properties. So I'll copy this first name property. Let's go to app-component.html, and on that first name input element, so here we have the first name input element, there we are using this ng model directive. So in order to do two-way data binding, first we need to wrap it within square brackets like this, and then we also need to wrap it within parentheses. And then to this, we need to assign a TypeScript expression. Here we are going to assign this first name property to this ng model directive. Let's do the same thing for the last name. So let me move it to a separate line so that it will be more readable. And again, here I will do two-way data binding. And to this, I'll assign last name. And let's do the same thing for email. So I'll move it to a separate line first. And then I'm going to do two-way data binding. And to this, I'll assign email property. Okay. And here the property name is last name, where n is caps. So let me copy this property name here and let's assign it here. So in this way, we are doing two-way data binding. Now what we want is, whenever the user start entering something in these controls, we also want to show what the user is entering. Okay, so for that, let me add a span, and here let's say you entered and then the value which the user has entered. So that value we are going to receive inside this first name property, right? So we want to show the value of that first name property here. I'm going to do the same thing for last name and email. So here also, after the small element, let's add this span, and here we want to display the value stored in last name. Okay, and here the property name is first name. So n should be caps here. Let's do the same thing for email. So again, I'll copy this, scroll down, and here we are displaying the email. And here, let's use the email property. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And here we have an error. Okay, if I open command prompt here, it says, so here also we have an error, and basically the building has failed. So it says cannot assign value $event to template variable email. Okay, template variables are read only. I think the issue is because here the template reference variable name and the property name is same. So what I will do is I'll change the property name here to maybe email address. Okay, and let's use this property. So here to this ng model, we'll assign email address, and here we will display the value of email address. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to command prompt, and now the compilation is successful. Let's go to the web page. Let's reload the page here. All right. So here you can see now it says you entered, and it's showing empty string because inside this first name we have not entered anything. If I say Manoj, then you will see that it says you entered Manoj. In the same way here, if I say Jha, it says you entered Jha. If I enter some email address, it says you entered and the email address which we have inserted inside this email field. So it is working as expected. Now, the one thing which is left here is I don't want to display this message you entered if the user has not touched this form control and he has not entered any value. I only want to show this when the user has typed some value in these form controls. Doing that is very easy. All we have to do is on this span element, we need to use ngIf, and to this, we are going to assign this property name. So if this property name has some value, in that case, this span element will be displayed. But if it is empty string, if it does not have any value, in that case, this span element will not be displayed. Okay, let's go ahead and let's do the same thing on other two spans which we have added for first name and last name. So here as well as here. Now for the last name, we want to check the value of last name property. So here to this ngif, we will assign last name property. And here for the first name to this ngif, we are going to assign first name property. So this property. Okay, so if the first name has some value, in that case, this span will be displayed. Otherwise, if the first name is empty string, if it does not have any value, then in that case, this span element will not be displayed. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Okay, so initially you see that span element is not being displayed. But as soon as we start typing something, then only it is showing that span you entered and the value entered in that form control. Okay. So in this way, we can do form validation and we can show some custom error messages whenever the form control does not contain a valid value.